try out single life. Try out the way the single at heart look at their single lives, which is to value your friendships rather than thinking about them as just friends, to value the time you have to yourself rather than worrying about, oh, am I going to be lonely? Think about what you can get out of your solitude, what you can do on your own, and don't use your alone time to do icky stuff like chores or things you don't like to do, but use it instead to do what you love to do. And think about singlehood as an opportunity to do all the things you might not do if you were coupled.
Welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we are considering the much maligned state of singlehood. At this time of year, Hallmark and Netflix conspire to tout togetherness so emphatically that many uncoupled folk feel like the awkward singleton in Bridget Jones' Diary, or worse, an evolutionary aberration. Well, to be fair, much has been made of the research which tells us that as social animals, we are wired for connection, and therefore we are generally carrying a higher health risk, or we are going to be unhappy if we are single. So that isn't a very complete or accurate picture, according to our guests today. We have two wonderful guests. Bella DePaulo is a 70-year-old psychologist who has been described by The Atlantic as America's foremost thinker and writer on the single experience. She's devoted 30 years of her professional life to studying the state of being single, in addition to being happily single herself. DePaulo challenges the notion that living the single life is something that people will settle for, like a consolation prize. Far from it, she says. There are millions of people all over the world who choose to be unpartnered and who say it's key to their leading a joyful, fulfilling, authentic, and satisfying life. Her new book, Single at Heart, has incited great interest, not only because the number of single people is growing globally, but also because it exposes many unfounded myths about being single. Bella is happy to challenge those misconceptions, and she's joining us today from California. Our second speaker is coming to us from the Public Library in Maryland, where he's taken a pit stop en route to Kentucky, and he's joining our conversation, Fenton Johnson. Fenton is a professor emeritus of creative writing at the University of Arizona, and he's written several books, and he also writes for Harper's, NPR, and New York Times Magazine. His most recent book is At the Center of All Beauty, Solitude, and the Creative Life. Welcome, Bella and Fenton.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, Bella, let's start straight away with you. What does it mean to be single at heart?
People who are single at heart love being single and want to stay single. They are happy and flourishing because they are single, not in spite of it. By living single, they are living their best life, their most authentic, meaningful, fulfilling, and joyful, and psychologically rich life.
Psychologically rich. So are these
Yes.
people not likely necessarily to be after making money and into all money-making business? Because some of the research actually showed people, I think in high school, that were asked about getting married, really value.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
you can
So
say
there
that
was this great study that followed people from high school until they were almost 30 years old. And when they were 30, they asked them, what matters to you in a job? And the people who were married said, oh, they cared about pay, they cared about advancement. And the people who were single said they cared about meaningful work. And what was really interesting about that is that back when they were in high school and no one was married, the people who would go on to stay single were already saying that they valued meaningful work. And the people who would go on to marry were already saying, I want money.
Gosh, that's interesting. So your
Yeah.
article in this month's Huffington Post challenged this whole notion of, I hate to use the word, spinsterhood, such an awful word. You have this community of single people on Facebook. So after the article appeared, that jettisoned up the numbers. So do you think it hit a nerve here?
It did. And if I can, let me read a few sentences that you included in one of your initial announcements of this forum, because I think it really goes to the heart of the matter. So, for people like me who are single at heart, the risk is not what we will miss if we do not organize our lives around a romantic partner, but what we will miss if we do. We would miss the opportunity to live our most meaningful, fulfilling, and psychologically rich lives by living someone else's version of the good life instead of our own. We would not get to be who we really are. And as you asked about the community of single people, this is an online community on Facebook of people who like being single. We talk about every aspect of single life, except the ones that everyone expects single people to be obsessed with, dating, trying to unsingle ourselves. No, no, no. We don't talk about any of that. We talk about our single lives, what's good, what's bad, what's challenging, what we love. And we talk about the inappropriate things people say about single people, and we make fun of them. And after that Huffington Post article came out, within the first couple of days, we got 600 new members. And I got about 100 emails from people saying things like, this was the first time they ever heard something like that. And they felt so validated by it. And and it's true. I mean, there so many of the narratives about single people are what I call deficit narratives. They're all about, oh, you poor thing, and let me tell you what's wrong with you and why you're not as good as those awesome coupled people. And I think in stepping forward and saying, hey, for some of us, single life is our best life, and I have the data to show it.
Okay, so speaking of data, what are the major findings from this 30 years you've spent looking at this topic, which challenge some of the common mythologies?
Yeah, so let me just first list some of the myths that my research on single people, especially the single at heart, challenges. First, that we're sad and we just keep getting sadder, that what we want more than anything else is to not be single, that we're selfish, that we're lonely, and that we're alone. So let me start with the alone one, because that's a big one. Single people are not alone. On average, they are more connected to more different people than people who are married. There's research that follows people from when they're single to when and if they get married, and it shows that when on average, again, there are always exceptions, but on average, when couples move in together or when they marry, they become more insular. So they don't pay as much attention to their friends. They don't call their parents as often. And it's not just that they're in the initial thralls of crazy romantic love. This still is going on 6 years later, which is as long as the study lasted. And it's not just people who have married people who have kids, even if they don't have kids, they do this insularity thing. It's almost like they take seriously those song lyrics. You are my everything. I just want to be your everything.
Well, um, we've already got a question from somebody. If you're single and you desire having a romantic partner but are having trouble finding one, do you recommend changing your mindset to give up on this desire? If so, how?
Um,
Good question.
well, I think that one way to think about that is to try out single life. out the way the single at heart look at their single lives, which is to value your friendships rather than thinking about them as just friends, to value the time you have to yourself rather than worrying about, oh, am I going to be lonely? Think about what you can get out of your solitude, what you can do on your own, and don't use your alone time to do icky stuff like chores or things you don't like to do, but use it instead to do what you love to do. And think about singlehood as an opportunity to do all the things you might not do if you were coupled. So try it out. For some people, it's just not going to work. I mean, some people are just so powerfully drawn to coupled life that they're not going to be happy unless they're coupled. We know that. That's kind of the party line. That's the story we're always telling. The story I'm telling is that there are other people who are equally powerfully drawn to single life, and coupled life to them does not compare.
Okay, so you talk about you're not alone, you don't. I think some of your research shows that people that are single tend to be much more inclined to be in voluntary organizations, to be
Mhm.
doing outreach work with their family, with their neighbors. Uh,
Yes.
so could you talk a bit about that?
Right. Yeah. So there are several national surveys, nationally representative surveys that show that people who are single, on average, are more likely to be connected to more different people. They exchange more emotional, practical, and support with friends, neighbors, relatives, colleagues. They are more likely to be there for people who need help with chores or rides to the airport or whatever when they don't want to take Uber. And that single people are also more involved in volunteering for just about every kind of organization except religious organizations. Married people are much more likely to volunteer for religious organizations. So I like to think of single people as having the ones. So people who are focused on marriage and coupling are all about the one. But single people, on average, are about the ones, and that can be an advantage.
Okay, I'm interested about the whole concept that you and people like you that really celebrate the situation that you've carved out for yourself. It's not a situation, it's a life you choose.
Yes.
I wonder if you might be wired, brain wired differently.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah,
Has
that's a
anyone done any
great
studies on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And no, there's no definitive research on that. My sense from talking to people in great detail who share their life stories with me or more informally talk about other particular aspects of their lives or the survey data from more than 20,000 people from more than 100 countries, my sense is that it's more than just a lifestyle choice. People who are single at heart are powerfully drawn to single life. Nothing else is as deeply, richly fulfilling to them as single life. And that sounds a little like hardwired, but yeah, I just don't know. And I also think it's a spectrum. So it's not like there's people who are single at heart and people who aren't, but there are people who tend to be single at heart and people who are mostly single at heart and people who are really single at heart.
Okay, I absolutely have to jump over to Fenton with this because he's had such an exciting and rich life, um, both in terms of it being extraordinary, but you not realizing it was extraordinary. I think you were the ninth child raised in a large blue collar family in Kentucky. You lived very close to the Trappist Abbey at Gethsemane. And so it was quite routine for a couple of the monks to show up for dinner. In fact, you remembered your mother dancing on the table at New Year with the monks. And this was an everyday occurrence in Johnson's household. And it wasn't until you kind of got older, you realized that this really wasn't just the regular old weekend activity at most people's house. So after which you left your small town and many adventures later, you ended up being in an intimate relationship with a partner who died of AIDS, I think in 1990.
That's
Okay. And then tell us what happened after that, because you expected to kind of find another person and repeat the experience, and that didn't happen.
Yeah, I assumed that I would go through a grieving period. I wrote a memoir about our relationship called Geography of the Heart. And I moved on. I thought, well, there'll be a period of grieving. One of the things that I learned, another myth that our society maintains, is that grief is something that has a fixed period and then it's over. And there is something, in fact, I think, noble. And the people that we love the most, we grieve for all of our lives. I'm not lost in that at all, but that person, that man, is still very much present in my life, as are all of the people whom I have lost in one way or the other. Anyway, I time passed and I dated around a bit, but after some period of time, there wasn't a relationship there. And I remember a day came when I'd done a lot of Buddhist studies, and I typed out a note and I put it above my desk saying, "Embrace your solitude." And I came to that observation via the Buddhist, because the Buddhist taught me that we're not living for tomorrow. We're not living for a year from now. We're living here. We're living now. And what I have here and now is what I is the only thing is available to me. And my challenge is to embrace it fully. So I said, okay, well, here you are at that point, 50 or so. Let's see how this goes. Go to the museum because you want to go to the museum. Go travel alone. That was one of the first things that I did. And I would say about being a solitary, that one does become, I think, more sensitive to the world, because it's the difference between traveling the world with someone else that one is constantly in relationship with, which is a joy and a pleasure. But when one travels through the world alone, and I've traveled to many strange and wonderful places alone, and some challenging and difficult places alone. First of all, one has to pay attention all the time, but also it's easier to pay attention because one is alone and doesn't have the necessity of and the pleasure of engaging with another person. So these are not these are not either or equations. I see them as both and. One can take joy in relationship with other people. One can also take joy in relationship with oneself. And so I've continued to do that.
You wrote this piece, didn't you, for Harper's quite a long time ago now, 10 years ago, Going It Alone, The Dignity and Challenge of Solitude. And you had observed the communal life of the monks that are single but living in community. And you kind of experimented, I imagine you lived in that situation for a bit to observe them.
Well, I really grew up a medieval life. I only know looking back, but I was over at the monastery probably once a week. The monks were over at our house 3 or 4 nights of the week. I came to know the cloistered life really well. The well-known spiritual writer, mystic Thomas Merton, my mother would give him rides to the train station, and she would argue theology with him while I would sit in the back seat. So there was an introduction to that life from early on. certainly I came to understand that solitude was a necessary aspect of life. There is a quotation it's the very end of my book from the playwright Christopher Fry, where he says, now I'm not going to be able to find it. It's at the end of the first chapter. No persons are free who will not dare to pursue the questions of their own loneliness. It is through them that they live. So I'll take a second to unpack those words, loneliness and solitude, and also the word boredom, which comes up a lot. What one learns is that in embracing that world, one grows into it. I've learned, I'm a novelist as well as a writer of creative nonfiction. I've learned that I need a certain amount of boredom I call it transcendent boredom, where I will make myself sit there. Don't get up, don't go rake the yard, don't go clean the refrigerator. Stay there with the project at hand, and interesting things come out of that choice, that active choice to stay there and be alone. A point that I make in my book is that the healthiest couples that I know are those who make a space for solitude in their partnerships. I had a discussion with my deceased partner once, right when we first met each other. Not long afterwards, there were two events. I was living in San Francisco. One was in the East Bay. My event was in San Francisco. His event was in the East Bay. And he said, I don't know what we're going to do about this. And I said, oh, I know what we're going to do about it. You're going to go to your event in the East Bay. I'm going to go to my event in San Francisco. And at the end of the evening, we'll have the pleasure of show and tell. We get to, and he didn't like that at all, but he was a big-hearted man with a good therapist. And a year later, he came back to me and he brought that conversation up again. And he said, you were right. We have a stronger relationship when we do things apart from each other, when we have lives apart from each other, and we bring those lives back together at times of our own choosing. So I think Bella, and I'll interrupt myself for a moment here to thank her for her work, because one of the things that I learned out of reading Bella's first book was when you read the data and when you read the studies, always look at the biases of the people who put them together, because you discover that the people who write the studies that say, for example, that a child raised by a single parent life does not turn out as well. You learn, lo and behold, the people who did those studies were married people who had children. And there's a certain inherent bias to that sort of thing that it's almost impossible to get away from. At any rate, I write about solitude and how, maybe to answer the question that came up at the very beginning of our discussion, how it is that one finds the greatest richness and wealth in solitude.
I will return the compliment. I really love your work. And when I write about it for my Psychology Today, Living Single column, or any other blog posts, it's always one of the favorites.
Okay, I'm going to bring up another sort of a myth, I think, in society. Because we have this kind of idea that marriage is this aspirational norm, and the very classification of unmarried suggests that marriage is the kind of the norm and unmarried is some kind of aberration outside of that. However, lots of people would say that the increase of single people, the decline of marriage generally, poses a threat to the needs and wants of society, that singles are self-centered and they're pursuing themselves and their self-realization. Yet your research, I think, Bella, shows the exact opposite, that actually there is this thing called the greedy marriage syndrome.
Right. Yes. And that goes back to one of the studies among many others that I described earlier, that when couples move in together or get married, they become all about themselves. They become more insular. Again, not all couples do this, but on average, that does happen. Whereas single people stay connected to more people in more different ways. They are also often the life of their communities. So they are more likely to participate in community groups and activities and public events. They enroll in more art and music classes. They go out to dinner more often. So, in a way, they are the glue that is holding us together rather than, the isolated couples that go off into their own little worlds or have their own little nuclear families and end up kind of disconnected. Again, not everyone, but in general. And then the selfish thing, this really gets to me. Really, single people are the selfish ones when the people who get married collect all the presents and they already have everything from from both people before they got married. But even more seriously, single people are more likely to exchange moral, emotional, and practical support with other people. Their parents may have pressured them to marry when they were young adults. But when those parents get older and need help, they are going to be grateful if they have kids, grown kids who are single, because the grown kids who are single are more likely to be there for their parents when their parents need help. And it's not just their parents. A study in the UK showed that when people need sustained help for 3 months or more, it is the people who are single who are especially likely to show up at their doorsteps. So I think the rise of single people is good for society, and it is also good emotionally and psychologically in that it suggests, and I think it does to some extent, that more people are staying single, not because, they couldn't find anyone or they have issues, but because they like being single. Single is how they live their best lives. And shattering stereotypes and myths about single people is important because it allows single people to grab on to the life that suits them best. It's kind of like when some of the biases against people who aren't homosexual started to fall. Of course, there's a long way to go, but that freed people to not marry someone just for show or because that's what you think you're supposed to do, but be involved with the person you care about the most, or not be involved at all if that's what you like. So I think that what I'm trying to do, which is to destigmatize singlehood and celebrate it, is part of a big historical study of progress with a lot of backstepping toward more people getting to live their best lives.
Okay, so you both talk about this sort of journey.
Say something about that for a second. I want to point out that the conservative Catholic columnist for the New York Times, Ross Douthat, I think
It's,
that's how to pronounce
oh,
his name.
yeah, yeah.
I was glad to see that he referred to marriage as that selfish institution. One of his columns, I was glad he was at least honest about that.
Hmm.
And I'm in Frostburg, Maryland, because I'm driving from my home in upstate New York to go to rural Kentucky to help out my 85-year-old sister who lives with her 86-year-old husband. And that's the role that I have functioned in a lot of ways in this large extended family, and I've enjoyed doing it. It's a pleasure. E.O. Wilson wrote in his book on human nature, the Harvard biologist. He was trying to think up some reason, some biological reason for the persistence of homosexuality in cultures. And he decided that cultures that have solitary people in them are are likelier to do better than cultures who don't, because you have these solitary people who are selfless, committed to the well-being of the community as a whole, rather than the well-being of a particular couple or family.
That's great. I love that.
There's so many questions. I've got a list of my own, but with so many coming into the box here, this is a good one for both of you. Does the joy of being single change as one grows older and perhaps feels the need to no longer be alone?
Oh, let me take that first anyway, then go to Fenton. There are actually like 3 big national studies in 3 different countries following people and asking them every year how happy they are, how satisfied they are with their single lives. And what they find is every year from age 20 to age 96, single people are on the happy end of the scale. And once they get to around midlife, 40 or so, when everybody expects them to be becoming sadder and lonelier, instead, they're getting more and more satisfied with their single lives. And the people who are not pining for a partner, the single people who have committed to their single lives and invested in them, are especially likely to be getting happier and happier with their single lives as they grow older. And I think it's interesting the question you brought up, Mary, or the person who wrote it in the chat box, which is the assumption that it's the lifelong single people who are going to feel regrets at the end of their lives or think that, oh my gosh, I better find a partner. And in fact, studies that look at this systematically find that people who have stayed single are the least likely to be having a hard time in later life. I mean, compare, for example, to someone who's been married for a long time and now they're divorced or now they're widowed. Well, they don't have the lifetime of experience at living single that the lifelong single people do. So while they were focusing primarily on their spouse, the single people were attending to the ones instead of the one. Single people were also figuring out how to do things on their own. So especially if you live alone, you don't do this thing that couples do that can seem like quite an advantage when it's happening, which is that, one person deals with, the car and the money and the dogs, and the other person deals with the dishes and the shopping, and it doesn't have to be sex stereotyped, but there's a split. So each person doesn't have to do everything, and that's nice. When you get to later life and you're widowed or you're divorced, all of a sudden you don't know how to do the things that your partner used to do, or you're out of practice doing them. Whereas the people who have stayed single, they either figured out how to do them or they figured out how to find someone to help or to hire.
Okay, so
I want to say as well that a big problem, there is an issue here, which is the issue of aging in our society, and people who, let's say, are married for 30 years, 40 years, and the partner dies. There is an issue with aging, but the problem that here, it's just like capitalism in our culture to say, you've done something wrong. You didn't get married and you didn't have a family, and now you don't have anybody to take care of you. Why don't we construct a society in which every person is valued and in which every person is taken care of? In Holland right now, there are many, these large, the Abbey of Gethsemane, which the Trappist Abbey, which once had 250 monks, now has 40 monks, most of them aged. It's this huge, beautiful facility. What is going to happen to those facilities? In Holland, they're turning those facilities into the ideal, but recognizing that lots of people want to live alone. They're turning them into small apartments where everybody has their individual space, and then there are collective areas which you can reserve to have dinner parties or whatever. So you have enough space in your own apartment to have, say, a dinner party for 2 or 4, and then if you want to have a dinner party for 10, there's a collective space. But they're converting those spaces into different uses. Whereas here in the United States, we look like we say, well, no, you have to get married. You have to, and your children have to support you in your age. We have a culture that does not take care of our own, and that is our problem.
Yes, if I can jump in here, that's something that is so rooted in the way we in the United States think about single people. Like it contributes to what I call the deficit narrative. If you're having a hard time when you're single, it's because there's something wrong with you, you deficient, limited person. And why don't we instead think about the ways in which society is set up structurally to make it difficult for single people in the way that Fenton just described about housing, but also there are there are hundreds of laws at the federal level that benefit and protect only people who are officially legally married, which was one of the motivations for people who work so hard to get same-sex marriage legalized. But an example of one of those laws is the Family and Medical Leave Act, where you can take time off without pay in an eligible workplace to care for a child, a spouse, or parent, or yourself. But single people can't take time off to care for someone who may be as important to them as a spouse is to a married person. So I can't take time off to care for a close friend or a cherished relative or anyone else that I just care about and want to be there for. And none of those people can be there for me under that law. So, that is a way in which the structure of society is making it harder for single people who want to care for others or want to be cared for by others.
I'll give a graphic illustration of what Bella just said. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was Kiplinger's The Financial Magazine. Somehow I was probably sitting in a doctor's office. It fell into my lap, and there was an article on how to maximize your Social Security. Well, I'm sure I'm interested in that. So I went to the article, and there were 4 closely typeset pages about how married people can maximize their Social Security. And then I turned the page for how single people can maximize your Social Security. There was one line. That was it. There was you can wait until you're 70. That's it. There was no other options for solitaires.
That's
Wow.
a really important example. I can work side by side with a married person for the same number of years and even do better work and more work than my colleague. But when he or she dies, their Social Security goes to their spouse or, under certain conditions, a whole series of ex-spouses, whereas mine goes back into the system. I can't give my Social Security benefits to someone I really care about, and no one can give their benefits to me. That's unequal compensation for the same work.
That's interesting. Okay, moving back to the more non-economic aspects for a moment. You talked about values, personal growth, and freedom. Well, it seems clear to me that if you have more time, you can devote more to your craft, your interest, your passions, as well as people.
Right.
So I'm wondering, historically, of course, all the lost painters and writers and artists, particularly women, that could never get round to doing anything because they were always having babies or cooking or God knows what. And it's funny because I just read Joni Mitchell's autobiography, and she mentions this is one of the reasons she didn't marry Graham Nash, even though she was desperately in love with him, because she said, no, 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 I owe it to all the ancestors, all the women before me that didn't fulfill their creative mission. I'm carrying the banner for them, and I must do this. It was remarkable that she felt that this was a cause, and that she would be, neglectful if she didn't devote her time. And she's been very prolific as a result. Do you find, because this is the subject of your book, Fenton, the creative life and solitariness, that there is a link between, for you, doing your best work in isolation, somewhat isolated?
Well, I did, as you mentioned, have a profound and a great love. I can't overstate how fortunate I feel that I encountered that person. He really changed my life. He was the only son of Holocaust survivors, and he made me into a world citizen. I was a kid from rural Kentucky, and he really he taught me French, gave me France, that's a big gift. At the same time, I figured out in like the sixth grade, I looked at the fact that I had 8 older siblings and they were already having kids. I already had nieces and nephews. I said, with 7.8 billion people on the planet, there's no need for my DNA. My contribution is to stay in solitude and to contribute to making a better world. I became a teacher in part because of that. And I knew that, the priest went around in the first grade and asked everybody what they were going to do when they grow up, and everybody knew that we were supposed to say priest or nun or at least get married. And there were 60 kids in the classroom, and I was the only person who said I'm going to be single.
I
So
love
that's
that.
something about Bella's, that somehow you knew when you were early on. I don't think, there are the collective arts and there are the solitary arts, let's say dance, theater, and of course one can extend that notion of collectivity to working on a project to get the sidewalks improved in your neighborhood, or working at a food pantry, which is what I do. These are collective projects, but still, even with choreography or theater, the person is going to spend a lot of time alone working out the creative demands of that particular project. In my case, writing is, of course, an incredibly solitary activity, but I've come to embrace that solitude. I also taught. Just this past week at a dinner, somebody turned to me and said, "Do you have children?" And
Uh-huh.
I finally learned how to answer that question. I say, yes, I've had hundreds of children. They're your children. They're my students, but they're your children. And in the Create One Learned and teaching creative writing, that I came finally to accept that my job in front of the classroom was to be a male authority figure of a sort that most of the people in the room had never experienced. They had only experienced men who were violent, or men who were abusive, or men who were indifferent or emotionally cold, and did not provide them a place for a kind of a notion of a man who could operate in the world in a very different way. And I really, that was such a privilege. That was such an honor to be, a father for people who lived, most of the students, most of whom came out of conventional backgrounds, who had never had that kind of experience in their backgrounds.
It's very impressive.
In
Okay.
my Single at Heart book, I have examples of people who are role models, and they include people, not specifically you, Fenton, but people like you. And I purposely included as role models not anyone famous, but someone that people noticed as they were growing up, who lived a single life, a full life, and and that stayed with them, and it was so important to them to be able to see that that was a possible, fulfilling way to live.
Interesting. Couple of comments again here. What about the single people being taken advantage of at work or in their families as parents age, while married people say they don't have the time?
Absolutely. I mean, this is this is an issue that comes up all the time, where in many workplaces, hopefully fewer as we go along, but in many workplaces, people expect the single people to be the ones to cover the holidays that nobody else wants to show up at work for, or to get last choice of vacation
Holdovers.
time. Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
plot of the holdovers, yeah.
So, yeah, so that is really so unfair. And the part about taking care of aging parents. So I mentioned the research that shows that grown kids who are single are more likely to do that than grown kids who are coupled. And there are several ways to think about that. One is the way people who are single at heart think about it, and the way Fenton talked about it when he talked about his sister, which is that, as one single at heart man said to me about taking care of his father who had dementia, he said, it was my honor to be there for him. Now, the flip side of that is when other people expect single people to be the caretaker, whether they want to or not, because of the demeaning assumption that because they're single, they don't have a life. So they're the ones who should show up. And that's a whole different thing.
Interesting. Somebody's asked, are there cultural differences in the life of solitudes regarding race, ethnicity, gender, or geography?
So we were chatting a bit before the program began, and I pointed out that African American communities are organized in radically different ways and are often actively discriminated against in our society because they don't match up with the conventional structure of a man and a woman living in a white picket fence house, because the list is, it's painful to investigate, to see the ways in which the African American community has been repeatedly over time discriminated against because its structures for its social relationships do not conform to what the white community demands. And my third novel has a Bengali woman character, and I lived in Calcutta for a couple of months to try to get to know the world, that she had grown up and from which she came. And I was warned before I went by friends of mine, you're going to asked this question the moment you set foot in a Bengali household, and it was, are you married? With the notion of, here's a prospect that I might set up with my daughter. And that led to some very interesting conversations because I said, no, I just said, I'm a gay man. And the woman I was talking with, who was a doctor, widely traveled doctor, said, I've heard about this phenomenon. And we got to be very good friends with each other. And at some point she said to me, what do we do about this thing of romantic love? I mean, doesn't it make sense that we can find your parents who know their children and love their children? We can find partners for them that are much better suited than this crazy thing, that this sexual attraction, which we all know is going to fade in, a month or 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever. And doesn't it make more sense that you would want to arrange your marriages for your children than to abandon them to romantic love? So it's just an example of a radically different set of cultural assumptions than those that prevail in this country.
Another question. I've embraced my solitude much of my life. Now, at age 81, I'm bombarded with health newsletters warning of the dangers of isolation, whatever that means. It's disconcerting. Comments welcome.
Oh, yes, I would love to take that one. The all these threats about if you live alone, you're going to be isolated. If you're old, you're going to be isolated. They don't take into account people's preferences. So living alone because you love living alone, like I do, is a whole different thing than living alone because you're divorced or you're widowed or you really wanted to be coupled, but you never could find someone. And there's a study in China where they asked people, I think 65 and older, probably thousands of them, how they were living, alone or with family or with a spouse or whatever the possibility was. And then they asked them how they wanted to be living. And the people who were the healthiest were the ones who were living the way they wanted to be living.
So this kind of flies in the face of a lot of the research that we get constantly told about, and health research, that you've got to be connected. Well, connected is a little different than coupled. We all agree we've got to be connected.
Yes.
But let me just take this question to Fenton right now. Since you were raised in this very rich and abundant community, both of family members and this extended community with the monks, did it not seem the natural thing for you to have all this kind of chaotic interaction around you in your life, that you would ease into this sort of quiet solitude? Obviously, you go into the university and teach, but basically you spend a lot of time on your own. You live alone.
Actually, what I miss most about the medieval world of my childhood, is the understanding, the cultural assumption that everything took backseat to having a good party. And I throw a really good party. I'm a good cook. I love nothing more. When I'm working on a book, I love nothing more than inviting 5 people who are smart and have an interest in what I'm writing. I don't tell them this, but I fix a nice meal and I come over and then I put to them the question that I am working on, and I listen to what it is that they're saying. We have this great interaction. I feel like it's been my life mission to, I don't know, pry some of my beloved married friends into having a richer engagement with the social world, and to, not look at your watch at 9:30 and say, well, we would have been in bed a long time ago if we. I say, come on, let's put some music on and dance. My mother, I write in this most recent book, At the Center of All Beauty. I write about how what the book taught me. One of the many things the book taught me was that my parents were each solitaries in their own way. They had their own spaces. My mother's space was the greenhouse. I never saw my father set foot in the greenhouse unless something was broken and she needed a second pair of hands. And my father had his woodworking shop. I never saw my mother set foot in the woodworking shop. And they spent a great deal of time alone, and then they would come back together and throw a big party. That to me is a wonderful way to live, to choose times to be alone and really to investigate your solitude, to see what lies on the other side of it, to go deep into oneself. I've done the first time I did a 7-day silent sitting retreat with a Buddhist institution, I thought, wow, I give myself permission to walk away at any point. I thought it was a really marvelous experience. It was a really rich and wonderful experience. This was with Zoketsu Norman Fisher, who has founded a group called Everyday Zen that teaches Zen out of the San Francisco Zen Center. And he was originally with the San Francisco Zen Center. But that was it is that creating that healthy interaction, that kind of balance between engaging with the world as a whole and then coming back and being in one's solitude when that presents itself.
I'm just going to read a quote of a couple of things you said. I began to realize that a lot of the writers, artists, musicians, and that I was attracted to or reading were people who themselves had never conventionally coupled. They tended to be alone throughout their lives. And I began to get a kind of uneasy sense of recognition that these people were me. So I began to look at their work more carefully and realize that each of them had a quality of work that I would describe as kind of essential solitude that they were giving expression to. So there's a deep knowing that comes from what you're talking about. I mean, spending 7 days with yourself, and I'm not sure a lot of people could do that. But you also said that solitude is the inspirational core for many writers, artists, and thinkers. I'm writing about people who have embraced being solitary travelers because in that embrace of their destinies, they find the richest possible way of being in the world.
Yeah, and when you say, well, first of all, one of the reasons why I absolutely believe in heaven, I believe that there's an afterlife, because I refuse to believe that the universe will not allow me to sit down to dinner with James Baldwin and have a conversation with James Baldwin, a solitary who changed the way we think about race and culture in the United States. You mentioned Joni Mitchell. The list of examples is inexhaustible of people who have served society and our culture best by honoring their solitude. What was the other thing that was the other aspect of your question?
Oh, just about the richest possible way of being.
Yeah,
Questioning that was
my father said to me once, and he did not intend it as a compliment. He said, given 100 ways to do something, Fenton will choose the hardest. Um, there's some truth in that, but you say, oh, I don't think I could do a 7-day retreat. Well, just give it a try. You can always walk away. If one doesn't challenge oneself, one can't grow. And it's in those challenges that we grow. So, I would say our evening began with a very good question. What do you do if you find yourself expectedly or unexpectedly as a solitary at a certain point in life and you're unhappy? What are some of the things that you can do? And I would say, I don't know what my principal advice would be, but I would say one of them is to rise to the challenge, to take those things that you've always thought about doing and didn't think you could do. I joined a chorus, and I'd never had any formal musical training. At the beginning of joining it, I thought, my wildest ambition is that someday I might sing Mozart's Requiem, but that'll never happen. And 4 years later, I sang Mozart's Requiem. I never thought I could do that. It's and that's an opportunity that one can take advantage of because one has the time available to do it.
Also,
don't underestimate yourself. I think that's
well, Bella, I think your research shows that single people are more inclined not to get stuck or fixed. They keep trying new things, correct?
Right. They keep learning and growing. Yes. And that's part of a psychologically rich life. It's part of what that means, that you have a variety of interesting experiences that expose you to different perspectives. And it doesn't have to be positive experiences like traveling the world, which of course it can be, but it can also be tragic experiences like widowhood, where amongst the awful experiences that many people have of profound grief, you also learn something new about yourself and who you really are, and how to be in the world that's different than it was for you when you were coupled.
Yeah, and the conventional notion in our society of a great loss like that is, oh, of course you want to have somebody around all the time. But in fact, there's a way that one comes to know oneself in sorrow that one can come to more richly and more profoundly when one is alone. not that those two are exclusive of each other, but that is something, we don't make space for that. Now, I could get off on a riff about how a lot of that is about capitalism and capitalism wanting to keep us dissatisfied, and so dangling something in front of us all the time that we can't have, such as, the perfect relationship, perfect sex, perfect whatever. Just let all that go and say, this is, as Mary Oliver said, this is my one beautiful life, and live it to the fullest.
Somebody's written a beautiful comment to reiterate what you've just been saying, both of you, about the richness of the living alone and getting to know yourself. Both of all his teachings, the most important one was you must learn to live alone if you want to grasp the meaning of existence. If you want to attain wisdom, you have to learn to live alone. This is the wisdom from the old stag to his son Bambi in Salton's original text.
Wow.
Somebody said, I taught this novel for many years in a course on Disney. This one line freaked students out a lot more than the death of Bambi's mother.
That's good.
Finally, we're all alone. Finally, we are. You got to walk that lonesome valley. You got to walk it by yourself. Ain't nobody going to walk it with you. You got to walk it all alone. That's a Black spiritual that, that's the human condition. So let's enter into the human condition together instead of, I get back to our crazy society, this crazy American thing that about how anything that goes wrong, it's all our fault. And instead, if we can see how to work together to support each other in our solitude, then we get the richness of solitude and we get the richness of community. And this country just isn't about that.
What needs to
we can change that. We can make it better. We can change it, make it better.
Well, I know you're not going to believe this, but it's 6 o'clock. We actually have talked for an hour, and there's probably another 20 questions we could easily deal with. It's been such an amazingly wonderful, refreshing take on this topic. I'm very grateful to both of you. So Bella DePaulo, who's got the book Single at Heart, worth picking up or ordering at the library. And then Fenton, I don't think we mentioned your book. Should we mention it again? The Creative at the Center of All Beauty,
well done.
Solitude, and the Creative Life.
And
another nice read.
And I profile a lot of those people. I thought about, do I want to spend the time it would take to get an interview with Joni Mitchell? I thought about, she was a candidate. I went through various candidates, and in the end, I chose the people. There are 11 people that I chose for one reason or another that one can find out in the book. But there are profiles of people and examinations of their work that look at their lives as solitaries.
So all singles and solitaries, take heart. So I want to thank Fenton and Bella for joining us. I'd also like to thank all of you for tuning in, and to Herbert Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, and of course, if you haven't given us anything in a while or ever, feel free to go to the website, www.cambridgeforum.org, where you can sign up for all of our broadcasts, and the website will also show you the next programs and all the past programs. Thank you all for joining me today and for all the forums throughout the year. And I look forward to seeing you all January 2024. Thank you. Bye-bye.